in finding their seats. And so we just wait a little bit while everybody gets online, and then we'll start in just a few minutes.
I was reorganizing my bookshelf because they were a little busy, and so I think I'm just going to turn it away from the reorganization effort.
You can see if you look behind me, Christian, that it's just a disaster back there. And
I keep all my mess on this side behind the computer, so you can't see it.
One of my
it's called Zoom glam. You know, you got to get the Zoom glam on. You know.
Yeah, you spend your time organizing your desk too much, you never get anything written and anything. You should always be afraid of anybody with a desk that is too clean.
Well, you have nothing to fear from me, I tell you that.
Right. But I will say, when we first, when I set this up during the early days of the pandemic, it was so clean and beautiful, and now it just looks like a pile. Things undone. We're still having people joining us right about now. Okay, I think that actually we are ready to begin. Actually, more people are now coming in. Hold on. It seems like we're having some people just continue to come in. Okay, we are going to begin this webinar. We're so grateful to have you with us. My name is Bill Danaher, and I will be the moderator of this. We are so grateful to have with us three leading panelists, and then the rest of us will be associating with this as we go through this incredibly important discussion on power, politics, and social change and protest. I'm happy to have with me the Right Reverend Robert Wright, who is the 10th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta. He was ordained and consecrated a bishop on Saturday, October 13th, 2012, at the Martin Luther King International Chapel on the campus of Morehouse College. He was a Navy helicopter crew chief and search and rescue diver. He attended Howard University in Washington, D.C. and graduated with a BA in history and political science. He worked for the Children's Defense Fund and as an advocate for 2 D.C. mayors, and his Master of Divinity is from the Virginia Theological Seminary. And he holds certificates from Ridley Hall, Cambridge, Christ Church, Oxford, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he has been awarded honorary doctorates from the University of the South, from Virginia Seminary, and the General Seminary in New York. Bishop Wright, we are so blessed to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
We also have with us tonight Dr. Angela Dillard, who is the Richard A. Meisler Collegiate Professor of Afro-American and African Studies in the Residential College at the University of Michigan. She has taken on a number of academic and administrative roles at Michigan, including serving as the LSA's Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education from January 2015 to August 2019. She is an interdisciplinary scholar trained in history and political theory with a PhD in American Studies from the University of Michigan's Department of American Culture, and she specializes in American and African American intellectual history, particularly around the issues of race, religion, and politics from both the left and the right sides of the political spectrum. Dr. Dillard, it's wonderful to have you back with us as well. We're so grateful that you've made time, and so honored to have you. And our third panelist that is going to be leading us with the remarks tonight is Dr. Ivy Forsyth Brown, who is the director of the Center for Ethnic and Religious Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Her research focuses on the incorporation of racial and ethnic minority groups into the US, Canada, and Britain. In particular, she is interested in the paths of upward social mobility and the overall well-being of these groups associated with kinship networks, social support, and transnational connections. Her research projects have examined racial discrimination, again, among Black Caribbean immigrants, transnational immigrant family relations, and patterns of kin support, the health of Black Caribbeans in the US and Jamaica, the socioeconomic status of religious affiliations of second-generation South Asian Muslims, and the intersection of family relations, gender, and educational attainment among the second-generation Arab American young adults. Ivy, we are so grateful to have you with us. We are always blessed when you join us at Christ Church Cranbrook for worship. We know that you are a parishioner at St. David's in downtown a little bit, and we are so grateful that you're with us tonight. And I'm so proud to have you as a friend as well. Thank you for being with us. We have with us people that you know. We have the Reverend Charles Christian Adams, who is the pastor of Hartford Memorial Baptist Church. He studied at Morehouse College and earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Wayne State University. He went on to earn the Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Adams served as the presiding pastor of Hartford Memorial Baptist Church for 11 years and is now senior pastor. He is a member of the Golden Key National Honor Society, a lifetime member of the NAACP, and currently serves as the first vice president of the Michigan Progressive Baptist Convention. And he's also co-director of the Institute for Advanced Pastoral Studies with me, a wonderful Lilly-sponsored program. And I am so grateful to have you with us yet again. And we are so honored to have you with us. I'm also proud to introduce tonight the Reverend Manisha Doster, who is responsible for coordinating and developing the church's mission and outreach at Christ Church Cranbrook, caring for the communications and IT of the church, as well as overseeing the pastoral care of the congregation. Pastor Doster grew up as a Jain, a religion from India, and was baptized in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod at the age of 26. She received a Master of Divinity at Duke University and was ordained in 2002 in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She has served various congregations in North Carolina and Michigan, and she was most recently part of Spirit of Grace Church in West Bloomfield, Michigan, a Lutheran Episcopal community from 3 churches. This week, Pastor Manisha celebrated her 5th anniversary of her beginning at Christ Church Cranbrook. We are so blessed to have you with us, and I am so grateful for your partnership in ministry as well as for your friendship. And then we also have the Reverend Chris Harris, who came to Christ Church Cranbrook from San Diego, California. Chris serves as the Episcopal Church as a member of the Board of Directors of the Episcopal Network for Stewardship, and also a member of the steering team for an organization known as Invite, Welcome, Connect, which is a national evangelism ministry based at the University of the South and Tennessee. He is also the creator of Living Wisely, Faith and Personal Finance, a ministry that helps people gather and think theologically about how they live and how they give. And he is a national speaker on congregational development, most often at the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, the Episcopal Church Foundation, and Evangelism Matters. And Chris, this represents close to your 3rd year. Is this your 3rd year or 2nd year with us at Christ Church Cranbrook?
I'm rapidly losing count, but I think 2 years.
2 years. So we are so grateful to have you, and I'm so proud to call you a friend and brother in Christ and partner in ministry. We are living, as many of you know, in an incredibly challenging time. And we wanted to respond in a timely and relevant manner because right now, as we are going forward, we are encountering probably one of the most powerful protest movements that we have seen in recent memory or history. And the protests in response to police brutality have raised questions around systemic racism, around inequity, and how and race relations throughout the world, but particularly here. As with any protest movement, there's always going to be a kind of difficult transition between the protests and meaningful, positive social change. So the three of our speakers tonight are going to speak about the relationship between protests and positive social change. What is going to be helped by these protests? What avenues are going to be open? What pathways that we can walk through that we haven't seen before? And also, what are going to be the speed bumps? What are going to be the challenges? What are the things that we have to do to dig deeper to make sure that some of the goodwill and benevolence and power and passion of these protests actually come into some greater fruition, and also provide opportunities for reflection and transformation in our wider society. So we are asking tonight to begin with Bishop Wright. Bishop Wright has had incredible work to do, not only managing his diocese through a pandemic, but also responding to egregious actions against African Americans in his state and in his city. And given that he has a pastor's heart and a prophet's vision, we thought we would have to begin with him because we want to hear what he has to say. But before we do, I'm going to ask Bishop Wright to begin us with prayer. And then before he gets into his remarks, I'm going to give you all just a quick review of how you can ask questions and make comments. So Bishop Wright, would you offer a prayer for us?
Thank you, Bill. Absolutely. Friends on the panel, as well as those who are viewing, if we could still our hearts for just a moment and pray. Oh God, you have bound us together in a common life. Help us in the midst of our struggles for justice and truth to confront one another without hatred or bitterness, and to work together with mutual forbearance, appreciation, and respect. Through Jesus Christ, who is Lord. Amen.
Amen. And for those of you, as we are going through this, we are going to let our panelists speak. That's going to bring us right to about 8 o'clock. And if you have questions, you can look at the question and answer bubbles that are at the bottom of the screen, and you can ask a question and we'll get to you. We also, I think, have chats that are available to you. So if you can add something in the chats, we'll be following those as well. And those are going to be monitored by both Father Chris and Pastor Manisha, who are going to be curating your questions so that we can deal with them in a good way. So without further ado, let's turn back to Bishop Wright.
Thank you again, Bill. Again, it's so wonderful to be with Doctors Forsyth Brown and Dillard, and my good friend, Reverend Charles Christian Adams, and a companion on the way, Pastor Manisha, and a new friend, Chris Harris. And of course, glad to be convened to have this important conversation by Father Bill, someone I've known for a long time and know that he cares an awful lot about this kind of work. Let me just sort of say right at the outset how sad I am to be with you tonight, that we are having this conversation. I'm 56 years old, and I'm having to have the same conversation with my young people, my children, college-age kids, and a high schooler in my home as my mother had with me when I was a high school-age young person, about this difficult line to walk between respect for law enforcement and fear of law enforcement, and how I was sat down as a young person, and it was shared with me how we navigate living at the edges of a society that uses our bodies and uses our creativity and uses our minds and intellect, but at the same time has systemic disdain for them. And so I'm sorry to be here with you. Have we made progress? Absolutely. But nevertheless, here we are having the same conversation. So in one respect, I'm sorry to be here with you. But on the other side of it, I'm glad to be here because this conversation represents people who have given their lives, their minds, their souls, the work of their spirit to try to bring love as a force into the world and overthrow some of the things that need to be overthrown, like race prejudice and race hatred in all its forms. And so here we are. As someone not having the credentials as the other esteemed panelists, let me start where I want to start. And that is that as someone who understands himself first and foremost to be a child of God, and someone who understands himself as to be a follower of Jesus, someone who is stumbling forward to follow Jesus, I find myself in this conversation because the image of God has been not adequately appreciated. Whenever we're talking about white supremacy or racism or any of the other isms, we're talking about what I like to call people being unmattered. And so what brings us to this conversation is that we have unmattered people systemically, academically, theologically, ecclesiastically, legally, economically, in any other way you would want to sort of name it. We have unmattered people. For 400 years, just 2 months shy of 401 years, African Americans have been in America, and we have been unmattered since we hit these shores. Prior to hitting these shores, we have been unmattered. We have been unmattered, and our personhood and our labor has been stolen. People have used power. People have used intellect. People have used the power of legislation. People have used the power of assembly. People have used financial power to unmatter a certain sect of people and to privilege other people. These are the facts of the case. They can't be disputed. The history books cry out that this is true. And so on one level, we have to make sure that what we're doing here today is encouraging one another for a long slog towards justice. And it would be surprising if any of us is here hearing this for the first time. It's hard to understand how we could be Americans for any amount of time and this be breaking news for us. Perhaps if it is breaking news, perhaps that in of itself needs to be interrogated. What were we doing previous to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and now Rayshard Brooks? That this sort of weaponization of the police missed our gaze, missed our interrogation, missed our investigation. What was happening with us before? So I guess what I want to talk about is, I want to talk about first and foremost from a theological standpoint, we're talking about the image of God here. And we're talking about implicit in white supremacy and racism is the unmattering of God, the unmattering of the other, and the unmattering of the planet. I'll just focus on the first two. We've unmattered God if we've adopted racist and white supremacy ideologies, right? What we need to talk about is, in terms of theologies, we need to say that white supremacy is also idolatry. That's what it is. And if you read the Bible occasionally, like I do, you'll realize that God has a very dim view of ideology in all of its forms. And so when we set ourselves up to privilege ourselves over God's other children, we're setting ourselves up at odds with God. We're making for ourselves an image to be worshiped, which should not be worshiped, right? And so that's number one. I think we need to talk about white supremacy as idolatry, right? And so I think we need to realize that, and then there's, time won't permit me to go down that road very long and very forcefully, but I think we need to take a look at it just that way. If we somehow find ourselves passively or actively worshiping whiteness, privileging it over other skin colors, then what we are doing is we've backed into idolatry, and that's an affront to God, and it frustrates God's reconciliation work. And so for the baptized people who may be around on this call, that is not who we are. In fact, that's exactly the opposite of who we are supposed to be. We're supposed to be doing the work of reconciling one another, which means we have to take up the work of fending off smallness, separation, and superiority. Those are the big three, right? If you're going to walk alongside Jesus, if we're going to ally first and foremost with Jesus, right, with the God of the Bible, with Jesus of Nazareth, then we're going to have to be actively fending off smallness in all its forms, separation in all its forms, and superiority in all its forms. And so if we find ourselves affirming those who have been previously systematically unmattered, we find ourselves, by virtue of our baptism, having a quarrel with the world, right? We find ourselves swimming upstream in the status quo. No two ways about it. So it's no wonder that we're finding our way to protest, right? Protest is justice seekers, followers of Jesus, people of goodwill, finding themselves aligning with God over idolatry, right? And so I have to say, I am not for violence in protesters or in police, but I affirm, as does our democracy, people's right to protest. In fact, I would argue that that is the most patriotic thing that you could do, is to work to make our union more perfect. I read that somewhere. And so from a theological standpoint, when we are protesting nonviolently, direct action with a clear strategy, being inclusive, allying with lots of people on a justice issue, we're doing God's work, right? If you remember the Old Testament prophets, they were not just sort of angry finger waggers, right? What were the Old Testament prophets? Well, Walter Brueggemann says that they were people with a heightened sensitivity for other people's pain in the system, right? They had a heightened sensitivity for cover-up. So whenever they smelled cover-up, they spoke up, they stood up, they took up dramatic action. And so this is what we're finding. I frankly am encouraged by the protest nowadays. Number one, because it has been sustained. It is sustaining itself. It is increasing in volume. It's increasing in the kinds of people who are joining. I'm so happy to see my white brothers and sisters, my white siblings, joining this, giving up silence and joining this movement. And so I'm excited about that. Like Congressman John Lewis, I am heartened to see so many people who could take up silence forsaking silence. And so there's an important moment for us right now. And I dare say that our president would not have been on the Rose Garden signing any legislation were it not for the protest that is happening in our city. And so a cautionary note here, I would just caution anybody who would endeavor in righteous protest to make sure that, like Dr. King warned us, to make sure that we don't find ourselves guilty of any looting or any disorderliness, because what it does is it diminishes the righteousness of our cause. So if you care about Black lives, if you care about Black people, if you care about injustice, then what we'll do is we'll discipline ourselves, right? So that we focus our energies on the protest at hand. And the protest at hand is there's rampant disparity in our police, in our policing, right? I work closely with the Atlanta Police Department, Chief Shields, who just resigned. It grieves me so, because she was exactly what we needed. I had worked with her before the cameras went on. Chief Shields was working for reform. Now, I also support the fact that she took her resignation, because we have to send strong messages from the top. And I'm glad also to learn that she's going to stay connected to the police office, to the police force in Atlanta as a reformer. And she may be able to do some wonderful reform work out of the formal title of Chief of Police. But we are working hard on that, and people are understanding that. But these righteous protests are accelerating, I think, in an important way, our need to get this work done. And so we have a moment that we need to seize. Theologically, how I get to protest is this. What leads us to protest is love. That may sound counterintuitive for some people. But what leads us to protest is love. Again, the prophets were not finger waggers, but they had immense reservoirs of love for the least, the disparaged, and the disengaged. And so what leads us to love is that wonderful quote from Dr. King, that justice is love overthrowing everything that is not love. And in another place, he said, justice is love rebelling against everything that is not love. And so this is really our marching orders. If we love, we realize that we are fastened to a spiritual force and not a sentiment, right? So what I want to say to people who, those good-natured people who are out there who are listening is, we've got to make sure that we distinguish ourselves from people who are sentimental about joining a moment and people who endeavor to be serious allies, right? There's a moment that we have to meet, amen, and twice on Sunday. But then there's a long slog that we have to really engage with, and we have to purpose ourselves to be with. This long slog won't be bought out by token legislation. This long slog won't be bought out by hashtags. This long slog won't be bought out by fine sounding words from pastors or politicians. It simply will not be, right? The slog, the allyship, is about a demonstrable change, measurable change. Nothing else will do. Nothing else will do. How I wish we could harness the resolve of those people who walked for more than a year in Montgomery until the buses were bent in righteous directions, right? So we need to sort of download that kind of resolve. Finally, let me say this. If we move from this notion of righteous power, that is protest, nonviolent protest, as we overcome the unmattering, systematic unmattering of people, what we've got to do is figure out how to build up capacity in one another, how to build up our capacity. I call that the pastoral care option here. So what I'm hoping is that in every organization that would be affiliated with this kind of work, and particularly in churches, synagogues, and mosques, the work at hand is capacity building, right? The work at hand is what I think we are seeing in some of the questions that we're hearing out there is what's surfacing is the deferred maintenance in our Christian education and formation. Why are we having these kinds of conversations? Because most of the folks, at least I know, have been living in the church all their lives. They've known of this Jesus all their lives, and yet so many are caught flat-footed now because Jesus also requires justice. How did they escape the knowledge that Jesus is both a political figure and a divisive figure? How did they escape that knowledge? Political, not partisan. Political in that Jesus was for justice. He was waist deep in the prophetic tradition that was all about justice, God and neighbor being synonymous. And Jesus is divisive. If you read your gospel this Sunday, if you're a lectionary church, Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set even family members against each other. How did we not know that? Why have we made Jesus into a milk cow, and not allowed him to be the raging bull that he is? And so I would say there's a word here for all of us who are in the spiritual formation business, right? We've got to reclaim Jesus of Nazareth from the Bible, and not the kumbaya, it'll be all right, lucky rabbit foot Jesus, right? The Jesus who was not impotent, the Jesus who was effectual. We've got to reclaim him, I think, because this sets us up and sets our taste buds for what really needs to be, which is nothing less than justice. I think this is the most patriotic thing we can be about, which is to systematically matter people who have been unmattered for 401 years. And let me just say, finally, so many of my white brothers and sisters, as they engage this work, think that what is required is guilt, shame, obligation, and self-flagellation. This is not true. That is a sad cul-de-sac to find yourself in, right? Breaking news. Black folks don't need white folks to confess that they have privilege. We've been watching this movie for 401 years. We know white folks have privilege. What is required of the moment? What is required is for you to do what my favorite theologian from Augusta, Georgia, James Brown, said we ought to do. And that is use what you got to get what you want. And so if you've got privilege, now's the time to leverage it for the common good. And so I'll stop there and throw it to the scholars on the panel. But I look forward to questions a little later in our talk. Well, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was remarkable. And there's no way I could even summarize the power of that. I will say, as a way of segue, that what's amazing about this is it harkens back the kind of experience that we're seeing on the street and what we're seeing people doing right now. For me, it's harkening back to other major movements. And just as a sideways move before we go right to where we need to go, one person that did an incredible study of the fall of the Berlin Wall was a sociologist named Albert Hirschman. And one of the things he noted was that you had two kind of disparate groups of people who were gathering in churches outside of the Berlin Wall. And one group was chanting, "We're not leaving," because people had been trying to leave East Germany for years. And they just kind of gathered, this group of people got frustrated, just started gathering. And then another group began to say, we are staying. And then those groups somehow, in the way that crowds get together, said, "We are the people." And at that moment, there was a kind of galvanization of the movement, and the Berlin Wall began to crumble. That was at that point when the soldiers began chanting, "We are the people." There was a moment in which they were able to suddenly envision themselves as someone different than they had been as a nation. And I bring that up because as I was watching these worldwide protests, I saw a similar kind of move happening that I hadn't seen in other protests in the past, in my memory. And yet there's a history of protests. And yes, there's a kind of a way in which protests move. And I want to turn to you, Dr. Dillard, to ask you to kind of begin to unpack that as it exists for us here.
Thank you. And whoa, Bishop Wright, that was wonderful. Really kind of quaking in my boots over here trying to follow that. But, I come at it from a slightly different angle. I'm a historian by both training and inclination. I kind of think historically, for me, history helps me to ground myself, to be able to figure out a complex moment, to start to pick it apart and to understand it. But here's the thing about history. It's not progressive. So there's an idea that the future is automatically better than the past. It's a very American idea. It's really kind of deeply woven into our DNA as a nation, but it's a false idea. I mean, there's nothing that says that the future is going to be better than the present and that the present is going to be better than the past. Yes, the arc of the moral universe is long and bends towards justice, but it needs pushing and shoving to get there. I mean, I think it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because enough people are willing to jump up and down on it to start to bend it in that direction. So from a historical perspective, I want to say that no matter the pain and the grief, the anger, the sorrow of this moment, I mean, I think we are a nation in protest and still a nation in mourning, as we continue to deal with the pandemic. I find myself welcoming the extraordinary national and global protests that have been going on since May 26th, which is the day after the murder of George Floyd. And actually, let me back up. I should say that the protests have really been going on since the moment that Mr. Floyd was dying at the hands of the Minneapolis police. Those gathered around were protesting. They were saying, I think he's not well. Take your knee off of his neck. Get him help. He hasn't moved in 3 minutes. We think you are killing him. So the protests, I think, start almost immediately in this act. That those gathered around were protesting, and they were filming. And I think that the second thing I want to say, just by way of a general opening, is that there's absolutely nothing new about police brutality and racism. It's just being filmed. And I mean, I think that's a really kind of powerful thing to know that, again, this has been going on. And think about the number of instances in which we don't know about it because no one was there filming. And I think there are now so many unnecessary deaths, so many videos for us to contend with, that I think, scholars like myself and the people who come after me are going to be arguing for years about why it was that the video of this one murder touched off day after day, week after week of protest. And what I think has really been one of the most honest sets of discussions about racism that I've ever seen in my 50+ years on Earth. It's not to say that it's perfect. It's not to say that it's solving everything, but it is, I think, a categorically unique moment in terms of our openness and willingness to have these kinds of conversations with each other, to try and dig deep and to try and really understand what's exactly been going on for so many of us in the United States and across the globe. We'll be arguing too about whether or not this moment is unprecedented in terms of its protests. It's a really interesting question for a historian. We have, I think, been living, I think for years now, in the sort of moral and political horizons of Black Lives Matters, which was founded in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. I think it matters that it was founded by 3 Black women. I think that that's the advocacy and activism of Black women in this moment, I think, has been extraordinary. They found Black Lives Matters after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. And then it picks up steam after the killing of Michael Brown and the protests in Ferguson, Missouri that following year. It's a heartbreaking and contentious slogan. I think it's a kind of slogan that no movement should ever have to have. I mean, if you think about what it is that that's saying, it's a slogan that names a pain that exists across communities in different parts of the country. It's an intriguing movement because it's so dispersed. It's held together by a slogan, an idea, a pain, more than it is by a structured national organization or even, a kind of traditional leadership model. So I think that there are a lot of really extraordinary things about this Black Lives Matters horizon. Let me also say about the contentious nature of the slogan that a lot of the activists associated with it, not everyone, but a lot of them have said something like, yes, we said Black Lives Matters. We never said only Black Lives Matter. We know that all lives matter, but right now we need your help with Black Lives Matters because Black lives are in danger. I mean, I think it's to really try and sum up why it is that this slogan in particular seems to resonate with so many people simultaneously in so many different places. I think Black lives are in danger economically in the midst of this pandemic. We've really seen, the implications of the vast chasm of racial inequality in this country. Black lives and Black health. Black lives have been taken. Black health has been damaged disproportionately because of the pandemic. We've seen this play out in the streets of our neighborhoods, in which Black people are over-policed and underprotected. I mean, think about what that means, right? To have the police everywhere, to have criminalization as a factor, almost by the time you're school age, you're going to be inducted into some form of criminalization, right? That's a glide path into a criminal justice system that has gone mad, right? And is incarcerating far too many people in far too many communities. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons why kind of Black Lives Matters in this moment has become an important slogan and a kind of rallying cry to organize all of this tremendous activity. I think one way to think about this difficult moment, again, historically, is as a part of the unfinished business of the post-World War II civil rights and Black power movements. So again, to kind of tack a little bit back to this, how do you historicize a moment like this? So how do you understand it as the unique moment that it is inside of this horizon that's really been building since at least 20 2014, and this particular iteration of the protest against police brutality and white supremacy. And then how do you historicize it? So how do you kind of put it in a fuller context? So there are a lot of attempts, I think, right now to make comparisons between, let's say, 1968 and now, right? So those last years of that we associate with the height of the civil rights movement. I think it works and it doesn't work. I mean, there's some things that are similar. There's some things that are very different. One of the big differences is that the civil rights movement unfolds across a period of tremendous economic growth. I mean, the years from Brown v. Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott forward, I mean, the United States was an affluent society. It was a post-war boom. It was just the kind of land of plenty. And to have a movement like the civil rights movement unfolding against that backdrop makes it very different from, let's just call it the Black Lives Matters moment, which is really rooted in calls for economic austerity, calls for defunding a lot of public services, defunding education, privatization, and certainly with the pandemic, economic collapse, mass unemployment, right? So, I mean, so again, I think it gives this moment a really different kind of character because it's playing out against that backdrop. I also think that that's one of the reasons why the protests so quickly went global. I mean, there have been global protests for years now against austerity, against privatization, against the dismantling of public life, against rampant global capitalism. I also think that this is one of the reasons why some of the targets of the looting, don't follow the traditional models of people in frustration and anger burning down their own neighborhoods, but going to Soho, going to Rodeo Drive, going to different places. And I mean, and really targeting some of the stores that are associated with global capitalism and the ravishes that it's been wreaking on the lives of so many people. So, I mean, I think people globally are making these kinds of connections, which again makes it slightly different, I think, from the moment of the 1960s. The civil rights movement was primarily a Black and Black working class movement. Certainly there were white allies and white participants, white students in Freedom Summer going to the South, but it was primarily an African-American movement, with white allies and white support at key moments. I think what we're seeing now is some of the most racially and ethnically diverse protesting that the country has ever seen. I mean, I can talk a little bit more about some of the measures that we've been looking at, some of what we know from survey data. I think, that the commitment of so many non-Black young people, trying to be allies, trying to stand in solidarity in this moment, especially people 35 and under. I mean, it's really been a kind of extraordinary thing. I mean, I think in some ways, we like to imagine that that's what the civil rights movement looked like, but it just didn't. It's not historically valid to imagine that the civil rights movement looked like what you can see now unfolding in Washington State or in DC or in Atlanta. There are some suburbs and towns holding Black Lives Matters, anti-police brutality, anti-racism marches that are predominantly white. So again, I mean, I think it's a really interesting thing to think about comparatively across that dimension. Both eras of protests, the 60s and the civil rights movement, and today in the Black Lives Matters movement, cared deeply about police brutality. And quite frankly, they cared about police rioting and violence. So think about Birmingham in 1963, which was a police riot against protesters. Think about Chicago in 1968, in which the Chicago police force lost its mind and beat the shit out of protesters up and down the streets of Chicago. And then think about the hundreds of photographs and videos circulating right now that document unnecessary use of force against peaceful, nonviolent protesters. I mean, I think, if we're going to think historically and look for some comparative moments, that's what it's like out there. And we look at Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, in which Bull Connor and the police force there let loose dogs on children, fire hoses on protesters. That's what some people are experiencing right now in some of these protests in different parts of the country. And I don't think that that's an overstatement. I mean, I really do think that some of this behavior is unconscionable, and that we ought not to support it because we're seduced by a call for law and order. And I think, calls for law and order in both time periods was used to literally tamp down calls for justice. And we could talk about this, we could think about it. Is it too provocative to say that either you're on the side of law and order or you're on the side of justice? But maybe you can't be on both simultaneously. Again, I think it's worth reflecting on and to kind of think about and to talk about. Justice is hard. Justice is disquieting. Prophetic voices don't leave you in comfort. Kind of echoing a bit of Bishop Wright here. We ought to be uneasy in this moment. As we're kind of called to do better and to be better, to try and create together a better society, to fulfill the promise of what a truly democratic America might look like, what an interracial, multi-ethnic, inclusive democracy might feel like for everyone. Let me kind of move towards a close by saying that, I think that was, at the end of the day, the enduring vision of the civil rights, of the civil rights movement, especially at the very end of the 1960s. Because the movement at the end of the 60s was edgy. It wasn't warm and fuzzy. People didn't embrace it. People were angry. People said that the movement had ceased to be law-abiding, if it ever was. If you think about what direct action and civil disobedience can actually mean inside of a closed, racist, unjust society. But in the last 3 years, in particular of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, and his words have been in a lot of people's mouth, I think, over the past few weeks, and in stunningly inappropriate ways. And that we really should remember the King of those last 3 years that found him in the pulpit at Riverside in 1967, preaching against the Vietnam War, saying that it is time to break silence on this. We have to come out against the war, no matter the cost. And it cost him a lot. It cost him white allies. It cost him Black allies as well. I mean, King was really on the road to becoming a pariah in those years. It found him in Memphis in 1968, striking with sanitation workers. And in that case, the slogan, and some people will remember this, hopefully everybody has at least seen the image of men wearing placards saying, "I am a man." I think that is as soul crushing, disheartening as Black Lives Matters, that you should have to campaign to demonstrate that you are a man, that you are a citizen, that you are deserving of rights and liberty and justice, should echo in our ears in the same way that Black Lives Matters does now. And it found King in the planning stages for his Poor People's March and campaign to DC, to bring thousands of poor people to the nation's capital, to really try and address three major issues. Militarism, right? Because he had already said that this war is killing us, right? That we are becoming a death cult because we are in love with war. Militarism, racism, and poverty. He said that that's the future of the movement. That's where the civil rights movement has to go. That's the end game. And so King wanted to bring thousands of people to DC and to engage in widespread civil disobedience in the city, knowing that that was going to wreak havoc and shut down the nation's capital. So again, really edgy, really confrontational. This was not a warm and fuzzy Martin Luther King, right? This was a determined, angry person who knew the end game and knew where he wanted to go. After which he had already said that, look, the American dream, this dream of the future, is going to turn into a nightmare, right? Unless we address these kinds of issues. They also wanted to lobby for what was called the Freedom Budget, that called for some $30 billion of investment with the goal of ending poverty and getting rid of racial inequality by 1976. I mean, imagine the audacity of this. They said that by the time the nation celebrates this bicentennial, we can end poverty. We can address the racial gap. We can move forward on dealing with the problems of militarism and racism. I mean, it just blows your mind, right? What they had in mind in terms of an investment. And let me say that if you can wrap your mind about that, let's take $30 billion out of a war economy and put it to solutions to poverty, to improve everyone's life. Then you ought, if you can wrap your mind around that, then you ought not to be afraid of the suggestion that maybe we should defund the police. I mean, it's not, I think people are really kind of nervous when they hear that, but we shouldn't be, right? I mean, because I think if we want to bend that arc towards justice, if we want to think in truly transformational ways, as opposed to piecemeal reform that is not going to solve our problems, then we have to be able to entertain these big visions and these big ideas. So King doesn't live to lead the movement. It gets stuck in the mud in DC, literally and figuratively. I mean, they're living in kind of camps and tents set up on a national mall in 3 to 5 feet of water, right? So the mud is everywhere. The campaign gets stuck. The lobbying is hard. But just think about what would have happened had King's prophetic voice not been silenced, had he lived, had we committed to this vision of ending poverty and racism, then decades ago. We are reaping the whirlwind of that missed opportunity now, of the neglect, of the racist policies, of white supremacy, and quite frankly, a failure of leadership that decided on a national level to commit to not a war on poverty, but a war on poor people. We need a reckoning. I think it's a moment where faith leaders and faith communities have a role to play. I think, we have a lot of work to do. We need to be good participants. We need to be good leaders. We need to be good allies. In some ways, what the Reverend William Barber has called for with his moral renewal, a moral movement in America. They're going to be convening virtually on the nation's capital on June 20th in a kind of attempt to redeem the mud from 1968, the Poor People's Campaign, and to try and think, what can we reach back to from that moment? Run it through the realities that we're living in now and think in big, audacious ways about transforming American society and realizing finally the promise of American democracy. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was so great. I am actually just going to go directly to Dr. Forsyth Brown because her work is it dovetails with your work in a wonderful way.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Yeah, there was so much that I was taking out of Dr. Dillard's and Bishop Wright's comments, and some of it kind of foreshadows things that I wanted to talk about, and others, I mean, I might take it in a different direction a little bit. I'm much more contemporary. I will be a little bit historical, but it's more to kind of set us up to where we are in the social context as to why now? Why are we having this particular unrest at this exact moment? But I also want to start by, because I'm also part of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force that is at the Diocese of Michigan. And I've worked with Bishop Gibbs and now working with Bishop Bonney to kind of connect the work of that we've been doing in the diocese with this conversation that we're contemporarily having. So earlier this year, I suggested to Bishop Bonney that we do a diocesan-wide book study using Jim Wallace's book, America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America. The goal of the study was to heighten the awareness and understanding of, in our parishes, of the issues of racism and in our society. Now, Bishop Perry set up a multiple-week Lenten Bible study that began in late February. And the book focuses on the apparition of systemic racism, which I'm going to define for those of you who are a little bit unclear as to what it is. Systemic racism is also structural racism or institutional racism. All three terms are kind of used interchangeably, depending on what discipline we're discussing them in. And it's systems and structures that have procedures and processes that disadvantage African Americans and other people of color. These procedures and processes have become embedded in our social institutions. So they kind of recur all the time, and you don't necessarily have to be racist or prejudiced or seek to discriminate against anybody for it to actually operate. So the book addressed those issues, and it also addressed issues of spirituality because it's written by Jim Wallace as a theologian. And it kind of dealt with some of the issues that Bishop Wright mentioned of whiteness and white privilege being idolatry, which I'm not going to get into. Definitely use the book for, I'm not a theologian, don't pretend to be, to kind of explain that. The book will explain it better. For those of you who have not read the book, I strongly encourage you to do so. I believe it is a beneficial first step to understanding the current social unrest, and it provides needed insight on the challenges of continuing white privilege in our society. Supporting materials for the book and resources, as well as recorded video discussions with Bishop Bonney and Sister V, are still available on the diocesan website, and so you can access them there. There's another text that I want to also bring up here that I think is important, and I'll circle back to it a little bit later, is White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. White fragility is the inability of people to discuss, white people in particular, to discuss racial issues, which includes white silence of issues of race and racism, defensiveness, denial, complicity, and apathy. If people are searching for a better way to understand the current, the persistence of systemic racism in the United States, I believe that this text is an ideal place to start. And if you've read both texts, I suggest that you read them again, because I believe in light of the current social context, you'll find them to be more meaningful, insightful, and reflective about what changes are necessary at the societal, local, congregational, and individual level to create a more equitable society for all Americans. So with so much happening and in so many places, it's kind of difficult to keep up with current events, and people can get overwhelmed. I know I've been frequently overwhelmed during this last several weeks with the social unrest and the continuing coverage of the global coronavirus pandemic. And I believe that these two events are connected, that the pandemic and the protest against police brutality and racial justice are linked, that the pandemic lockdown that idled so many people is correlated to the ability to have time to be reflective about what's happening in our society, but also to have time to go out and protest. So the increased unemployment, lockdown frustrations, and the size and the duration of the protests are definitely linked and correlated. People have time to protest and protest consistently. I seriously wonder if there had been no pandemic and no lockdown, if protests of similar scale and frequency would have occurred after the recent events. I'm not suggesting that no demonstrations might have happened, but this has been sustained and it's so wide and broad-based. I just can't imagine that this would have happened outside of this very unique situation that we are currently experiencing here in the United States, but also globally. The pandemic has allowed us to slow down, to be reflective. And it has put us in a prime position to be thoughtful about who we are as a nation and who we want to be in the future. And so I believe that this is definitely an undercurrent of why people feel compelled to go out. We've seen enough video evidence of police brutality. We've seen this injustice displayed on our TV screens and our social media for numerous years now. And we can go back to the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles, our first video that we saw, which was analyzed and deconstructed to suggest that he was doing something other than what he was doing, which is getting the crap beat out of him by the police. So with enough evidence, I believe that we're at a place where even the most skeptical in America can agree that we have a pernicious problem of systemic racism in our society. And this problem is most visible in the police interactions with Black and Brown communities. I also believe that the general public has become intolerant of any more police videos and killing of unarmed African Americans. That the default setting of believing the police first and the victim's family, and however many witnesses might be there, second, has been altered, and that we are now being a little bit more critical of what the police are doing and how we should react to those particular actions. And this, to me, is very welcome change. So I want to talk a little bit more about the social context of the current situation, particularly in the African American, Latino, and Native American communities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And in many ways, this precipitated the protest against police harassment and brutality. And then finally, I want to talk about the kind of this time as a social movement. And in many ways, the awakening of much of white America to the problem of racism and racial inequality in the United States. And this is coming after generations of denial. But I do still believe that we face some obstacles to eliminating systemic racism. And I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. So starting with the social context, the significant impact of the pandemic on communities of color has aggravated previous underlying conditions of social inequality in housing, education, employment, and healthcare access, as well as healthcare outcomes indicated by the significant prevalence of comorbidity conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease in communities of color. Comorbidity is associated with worse health conditions and more complex clinical management, which we have seen in a significant number of serious COVID-19 cases and deaths among people of color. Research on comorbidity indicates a relationship between stress and conditions such as hypertension, stroke, and heart disease. Increasingly, studies, even some of the studies that I've participated in, have suggested that stress related to microaggressions and discrimination, including everyday discrimination, significantly contributes to the prevalence of these conditions in Black and Brown communities. In other words, racism and discrimination are making people sick. Now, this is underlying. So we have the stress of the pre-existing conditions and inequality within Black and Brown communities. Now we have this illness that seems to be really ravaging these communities, creating worse health conditions than other communities in the United States. And Additionally, African Americans and Latinos are heavily concentrated in both of the employment sectors that have been hardest hit by the pandemic and lockdown. So the service and manufacturing workers who have been laid off or are now unemployed, and essential and frontline workers who have been overworked during this crisis, from bus drivers, delivery drivers, grocery store clerks, and those working as nurses, medical assistants, hospital food service, cleaners, etc. All of this is combined with police hyper surveillance and harassment in their own communities. And you can see how all of these frustrations might gel together, culminate into something that could lead to some more organized social protest. So in essence, the African-American community was highly stressed prior to the incident with George Floyd. The societal problem of systemic racism has been well documented. For many in the African-American community, we've wondered why the American society has failed to listen to our pleas and address these issues in previous decades, including all of what Dr. Dillard discussed in the civil rights movement and post-civil rights. So in 1967, as Detroit was in the midst of wide-scale civil unrest, known to those in the Black community as the Detroit Uprising, and to those outside as the Detroit Riot, President Johnson appointed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, more commonly known as the Kerner Commission. They were tasked with determining why such social unrest was gripping the country. We had Watts in 1965, Chicago in 66, Newark in 67, and then Detroit in July of 67. The commission's 1968 report concluded that the country was moving toward two nations, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. The commission recommended bold, comprehensive, and immediate actions to address racial inequality across the country. These recommendations were largely ignored. It just so happens that Johnson was facing re-election, discussing racial inequality, wasn't going to play with his constituency, and so for the most part, these recommendations were shelved. And what a shame. Maybe we could have addressed these issues and alleviated or at least prevented some of the current situation that we have, and definitely a lot of pain and heartache that we had in the years since. By the 1990s, scholars were again highlighting the continuing problems of racism and racial inequality in American society that was causing multiple social problems and immense social and financial costs. So we have 1992, Andrew Hacker, he publishes a book that he uses the Kerner Commission report to title the book. It's called Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal. And then in 1993, we have a text by demographers Douglas Massey and Nancy Benton, American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass. That text demonstrated how persistent lower socioeconomic positioning among African Americans was directly related to deliberate segregation in American cities. So social inequality was correlated with our housing and segregation, residential segregation. Then later we have in 1996, historian and sociologist Thomas Sugrue. He had addressed similar issues in the origins of the urban crisis, race and inequality in post-war Detroit. And of course, Michelle Alexander's 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness. That text deftly discusses how in the post-civil rights era, our society reinstituted Jim Crow through the social control and policing of African-American communities and other communities of color, which led to mass incarceration. All of these works indicate that American culture, society, and policies have treated African Americans, Latinos, specifically Mexicans and Native Americans, as what sociologist Robert Blauner referred to as colonized minorities. Colonized minorities are populations that must be made to stay in their place through law, policy, social control, and force if necessary. The police are instruments of the social control that is necessary to make sure that these colonized minorities stay in their designated residential areas, whether it be the inner city or rural, other side of the tracks areas, or that they are proceeding in the dominant space in appropriate ways, that they're operating in ways that is socially acceptable to the dominant group. And if they don't, they are reprimanded in a variety of various ways. So here we are in the second decade of the 21st century, and it appears that we're on the verge of finally addressing the long-standing issue of systemic racism. For most Black Americans, the sentiment is, it's about time. But okay, we're here. And we're finally at the precipice of substantial, monumental social change, seemingly ready to address America's original sin of racism. Why has it taken so long for us to arrive here? What might keep us from enacting the level of social change necessary to fully address systemic racism? What obstacles might slow, inhibit, or derail this much needed social change? I suggest that the convergence of colorblind racism and white fragility remain as the most viable obstacles to substantively addressing and dismantling systemic racism in America. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva's term, colorblind racism, refers to the new means that white privilege has been sustained in a post-civil rights age. And it has four central themes that I'm going to outline. Abstract liberalism, which uses ideas associated with political and economic liberalism, such as equal opportunity, meritocracy, and individualism, to explain away racial matters. So in other words, it sustains racial inequality by seeking to make sure the status quo of equality, or the vision of equality, is maintained and meritocracy is maintained. So we can't have affirmative action because it is unfair. It's not equitable. It's not a meritocracy, and it's not equal opportunity for everybody. But as we know, historically, everybody was not given the same level of disadvantage. We didn't have laws and policies that were directed toward making sure that their economic, educational, and social advancement was not accomplished. So the second frame is naturalization, that enables whites to attribute race-related issues to natural occurrences, such as it is natural for people that are similar to want to be with other people who are like them. It's a means of justifying, in many ways, all white neighborhoods, all white schools, or all white churches. Third is cultural racism, which employs culturally based arguments to explain the position of minorities in society. This frame denies the structural elements that I discussed above within our society that have existed over a historic period of time and have operated to systematically limit opportunities in the advancement of minority populations. Fourth is the minimization of racism, which suggests that racial targeting and discrimination are not a central factor that affects minorities' life chances. It is a denial that racism still exists in contemporary society. This frame has been most impacted by the recent events and protests. Much of white America is at least no longer in denial that systemic racism exists. Commentators, police chiefs, various members of Congress have all acknowledged in the last week or so that systemic racism is a problem in America. And for me, that is considerable progress. So we've just begun, and we have a long way to go to dismantle the system of racial hierarchy, privilege, and suppression that began in 1619. It is important for people to do the work to understand how systemic racism began and it became embedded in our culture and social institutions, which is why I gave you some books to read. A full social movement to end systemic racism will need to move from the present day initial unrest and agitation that we are seeing every day on television to resource mobilization. So in the study of social movements, there are five to six different steps that social movements need to go through in order to become fully formed. Actually, I think there's only five, and the last one's denial. So to move from this unrest and agitation to a fully organized social movement, we need resource mobilization. And this is where time, money, and resources is committed to the goal of the social movement. And it will transition us from one stage to the next. To be successful in dismantling systemic racism, it will require both a change at the societal level, and at the individual level. So social movements, there are 4 different types of social movements. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first is reformative social movement, which requires reform of major aspects of our society. And this is what was being talked about in the new policies for policing, the Camden kind of approach with community policing to defunding the police and a variety of other things that are in between. So it's taking what we currently have and reforming it in some type of way. The next is an alternative social movement, which deals with the individual level, and it basically causes for changes in the individual behavior. So the third, which is kind of connected, is also at the individual level, is a redemptive social movement. And that calls for redeeming the individual through total change. Now, as Christians, we're familiar with the notion of redemption. Denial, defensiveness, apathy, inaction, none of that is going to lead to redemption. So we have a mighty task that's ahead of us. There's a lot of work to be done. It's going to be done at multiple levels. Resources are going to need to be committed in order for us to do this over the long haul. And while I'm hopeful and encouraged by what we're currently seeing, that we're finally addressing these issues after so much passivity and denial, I'm kind of apprehensive about how far along we could possibly get in the next stage. I'm hopeful and prayerful, but we'll see. So I'm going to stop there.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Forsyth Brown. That was such an important match to these other incredible presentations. And I feel as if we have actually, in a rare moment, we've been able to see truly in a circumspect way, is what one theologian would call it, Karl Barth, but also in a kind of panoptic way of all the issues that are facing us, both the spiritual and the historical and the sociological are all figuring in at this point. And so I want to thank each of you for these incredible remarks. I am aware that, and I also want to let you all know who are following along this webinar, we're going to the extent that some of our panelists had some prepared remarks, we're going to try to shape those and get those to you. And we'll also certainly send along the bibliography that Dr. Forsyth Brown brought up. So I know some of you were following along, but there's some others, you know, the piece that, you know, on colorblind racism is an incredibly important book. And so I'm just going to send those to you as well. With the time we have, I'm going to ask for brief remarks from Reverend Christian and Pastor Doster and Father Chris.
Thank you very much. I've been struck by how well prepared our panelists have been. I got something out of each and every one of them to understand that this disparity that we are encountering in life and death issues relates to a very profound theological problem. And that is important because the structures of racism were supported by the church. You had to justify it. You had to make sense of it. So W.E.B. Du Bois, The Soul of Black Folk, was a response to those theologians who were saying we did not have souls, that we were not the imago Dei. We were not made in the image of God. And to correct it, we as people of faith must accept at the deepest spiritual levels that we are heretical, we are blasphemous, and we are idolatrous if we interpret it any other way. That we must speak up, forsake the silence. What I really loved about Bishop Wright was when he called us to build capacity. And this was reiterated. It is, how do we solve the problem? We must build it on the spirituality. The Bible says, if we are believers, out of our heart, or some interpretations say out of our bellies will flow rivers of living water. So where do those reservoirs of living water come from? It has to start in our spirit, and then it will go into society. And when Dr. Dillard then struck from the historical perspective, she brought some very powerful things to mind. Really, all three of them gave words to a lot of the disparate thoughts that were just kind of in the air and in my mind. They brought it all together. They synthesized it all. But the fact that this movement has been televised, not, as Gil Scott-Heron said, not on ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, but on a lot of people's cell phones. The power of image, which helped the civil rights movement. Now the internet, so that we can gather. You know, I wasn't invited to the initial protests, and that kind of threw me, because I was waiting on somebody to call and say, Reverend Adams, we're having a protest at such and such a time. And I kind of felt left out. And then somebody said it was on Facebook, man. You know, look, it wasn't, it was on the internet. And this has preempted. And we've seen in cases, even in the breaking news, a lot of the websites are beating the news channels. But particularly when she, said this is a tragedy, when we have to argue whether we are men or our lives matter. It reminded me of Sojourner Truth, who said, ain't I a woman too? You know, that really talked about the womanist problem, where African-American women have been left out even of efforts to give women rights and standing in society. But certainly she went into so much more, and it really gave words to my understanding that I love the fact that we're talking about police reform. I love it. But if it's not, as King had, a three-pronged effort, the militarism, the racism, the poverty, and that is so important, because all of that money that we're putting into military work all over the world, we could be putting into research. And racism is so pervasive. You have to understand what that means to people when they look at themselves and they do not like what they see. When they feel that their image somehow is devalued, and they have to prove themselves. They have to work twice as hard, as my grandmother used to say, as everybody else. The problem there, and the fact that it's not just hurting those that are victims of it, who are on the negative end of the critique, but it is in the denial of resources, but it's hurting everybody because it gives you a false sense of security. That's how we can be divided. That's how we can be distracted by the distortions of race. And that is how certain administrations have been elected, because they have played that card, that you're better than the other race. And they bought into it. And some might feel that they bought into it at their own detriment, because poverty is not being dealt with. War on poverty, war on poor people. That's what we're seeing right now. And that is the issue. And finally, I mean, there's so much I just want to say. I just thank you. You gave me so many notes. And I know you gave everybody else so many notes. And I could talk 10 more minutes on every panelist, but I want to hear from Manisha, and Pastor Manisha, and Pastor Bill. So the last thing I'll say is, just when I thought my cup was full, amen, the word came to pass. My cup ran over with the sociological analysis of the here and now. I mean, this is as complete a discussion as I have ever heard or had on the issue, because as Dr. Forsyth Brown has said, these events, these catastrophic events are related. The inequities that we are seeing in society are causing the morbidity. They're causing, so whether it's police brutality, and we know if you're a Black man between the ages of 10 and 34, you are more likely to die from police brutality than anyone else. And it's a major contributor to our demise. And we know that we're predisposed to COVID-19. So the thread is a lack of resources. So inequality becomes a death sentence. And we have to see, it's not just the fact that it's unfair. We know it's unfair, but that's not the issue. The issue is it's a life or death issue. And you have to start dealing with those issues. You know, one of my members is a retired educational administrator, and she said because of the lack of resources in the Detroit public school system, they were not able to have a nutritional campaign that would start in the school, in the cafeteria, in their curriculum. Now, follow me now. They started it, but then because of the lack of funding, they had to stop it, like they stopped fine arts, like they stopped a lot of athletic programs and whatnot. Because of this, they were never really able to do who had diabetes, and they grew up to become those who were diabetic, who were predisposed to COVID, and maybe those who perished from COVID. As Dr. Brown said, this instability hurts everybody. Everybody loses in this case scenario. And finally, even the police lose. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in the letter of the Birmingham jail, hey, the guards should be out there protesting with them. And the police who are forced, right? Because they're trying to make a living. They are forced to keep in place the structures and the vestiges of this kind of inequality. And they have no choice in the matter. They must control people. And the kind of pressure that they are under on a day-to-day basis in the community. See, a lot of times you may see them shoot somebody, you may see them choke somebody, you may see them do something that is egregious and wanton, but understand this, it can be an aggregate of frustration, because what we've done is created a cauldron that is very difficult to keep the lid on. And with that, I will pass. But remember this, while we're out here saying no justice, no peace, somebody needs to say no reparations, no peace. Somebody needs to say no defunding, no peace. As was said by Dr. Dillard and all of our panelists, we've got to do something avant-garde. We've got to do something outrageous. We've got to start looking and understand, as I heard Michelle Alexander say this herself, she is talking now about deconstructing in order to reconstruct properly, that there's no way, the way society is presently constructed, that you're ever going to get justice in our legal system. We've got to deconstruct it. So maybe now is the time to start speaking about some of these radical changes, because if we don't, we're going to leave it for the next generations to deal with. God bless you.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. That was amazing. We are moving towards the end of our hour. We have a lot of good questions. This is what I'm going to propose we do, and I'm doing it right on live TV. It sounds like we need to have a follow-up to this. Next week, we did plan. We have wonderful people coming to talk about arts and arts organizations and social rebuilding after COVID. But I would like to invite our three panelists back after that in July for another couple of conversations, because I think to speak briefly, and then I want to hear from Pastor Manisha and Father Chris. I think that we're touching upon some really important things. I think a lot of people have written with extraordinary questions. I'm aware of the time, and I think if we could provide some opportunities for further reflection on this, I think it's going to be this particular triumvirate of speakers are actually bringing us further along than I can imagine. I don't think I could have imagined it beforehand. So no pressure. We'll talk.
Bill, I feel like I've audited a class somewhere.
Yes. Well,
this has been amazing.
And Christian and I had been speaking about how to deepen our curriculum for the work that we're doing together with Pastor Manisha on the Institute for Advanced Pastoral Studies. And I think this kind of conversation is a way to broaden that curriculum and to continue it for pastors. Turning to Pastor Manisha.
I don't want to be long, and I clearly we've all heard some amazing things that we all need to process. And so I'm glad to hear that we will have a part 2. I think we all will benefit from it. Good news is that this is being recorded, so you can go again back to hear everything carefully, and so you can follow along, so you can catch it on YouTube. I'm just going to add 2 things. I think what happened to George Floyd by Derek Chauvin was an iconic moment for all of us, because what it showed us, every single human being, it showed us that we don't want nor like nor can stand it when someone is being devalued, when someone is being treated less than a human being, when someone is disrespected, when someone is dismissed, someone is discounted. We don't know how to live with that as human beings, because it's not right in any sense of the word. And that is why this has affected Blacks, whites, browns, and everything in between. And I think that teaches us that that's internal to us, that's who we are, and that's what's going to continue the long, hard work of changing how we interact with one another. This is a protest, it's a social movement, but it's more than that. It's it's claiming our identity as human beings. We are so much better than this. And so that is what I'm holding on to. I'm going to recommend between part 1 and part 2 that you watch the film The House I Live In. I just watched it this week. I found it really, really eye-opening on what has happened with the police force over the decades, and what may have been the exacerbating problem that has caused such agony in both in the ranks of the police and in our beloved communities.
Father Chris.
Yeah, as I reflect on all of this and we start to talk about doing a follow-up, I'm really drawn to the idea of perhaps a theme for this follow-up could be moving from allies to accomplices, however we want to use the terms. But how can we begin to empower ourselves and teach our congregation, assuming we have sympathy to the cause, how can we give them power to do something with it, with that sympathy, how to go beyond. I know there's a lot of people who'd love to go to protests, but they don't feel safe because of COVID. Or, I took my girls to most of the protests that we could go to in San Diego. The ones I've seen locally, I'm not sure I would take them there. They're 3 years old, and there was just a little bit too much rough and tumble going on. But there's a lot more we can do than just being in the streets. And so moving from allies to accomplices, and also what is the role of relationship in that movement? As a gay person, that is my primary target identity of sorts. As I reflect on this, on teaching my friends and my family members about systemic oppression that I faced, that they were utterly unaware of or blind to, I found that the most powerful thing was being in deeper relationship. And sometimes that meant doing the hard work of staying in relationship when they weren't getting it. And it wasn't a matter of arguing. It wasn't a matter of showing them more videos sometimes. It wasn't a matter of getting them to read more books. Sometimes it was about doing the deep work of listening to our stories and just doing the hard work of relationship. I've seen, and I know many people in the LGBT community, for example, who have seen transformation happen by staying in relationship or making the extra effort to go deeper in what were otherwise kind of safe relationships. So those are two topics that I'm interested in continuing this dialogue around.
And I want to begin by saying thank you to that, because I think actually I am uncomfortable with the word ally, because it assumes that somehow I can come alongside without being changed in the process. And it also assumes that somehow my destiny doesn't get tied to the destiny of the person that I am allying myself with. And I actually think ally is, and I'm sorry to use this term because I think people use it, it's a term of privilege. And it's a term of privilege that is unyielded or unused. But I think the only way forward is to seek deeper relationship, and I appreciate it. I want to say a couple of things. First, nothing makes me more happy in life than to say I was right. It's my greatest thing I love. And Rob knows this, and Ivy knows this, and I think Christian knows this, and I know that Chris and Manisha knows this, that I love saying I was right. And often I am, and that's exciting. I was really wrong about 4 weeks ago when we had the meeting with Charles Blow, and I turned to Dr. Dillard and I said, popular protest just doesn't seem to be working like it used to. And I used the example of the Poor People's Campaign in Detroit, where we had 160 people arrested, not one bit of peep in it for anybody. And I thought I had really made a really strong point. And I was wrong. And you were right. And I am grateful that you were right. And I believe that this is an incredible moment for us. And if I were to add one little bit, I would go back to Mammy Elizabeth Till Mobley, who made the determined decision to show her son Emmett's body and to have an open casket funeral. And that was the beginning of the visibility of Black suffering, and in a way that could not be denied. And the same thing happened. And what we've seen is there's been some engines of cultural acceleration. The pandemic, obviously, cell phone technology, obviously, and that gives me hope. So I am so grateful for each of you being part of this. I'm sorry for kind of strong arming you into another couple of meetings about this. I do believe what we do in this webinar is going to be profoundly powerful and transformational for many people, because this offers some of the best of what we can do as the church in the world, working on behalf of justice. For all of you who have been here, I want to thank you profoundly for your questions tonight and your comments. I want to apologize from the bottom of my heart for how, that we weren't able to get to them, but I please stay tuned for part 2 and maybe part 3. Without further ado, Reverend Christian, will you close us in prayer?
Let us pray. Our creator, our sustainer, our deliverer, our provider, our redeemer, and ultimately our savior. You who are enduring hope that will not die. You who are everlasting love that will not let us go. We come before you joyfully tonight, thanking you for the sin that has merited so great a redeemer. We thank you for the chaos and the crisis that has brought us together, not only on this webinar, Black and White, Old and Young, City and Suburb, across the lines of denomination, class, and other specificities. We thank you, oh God, for this pain, because if we did not have it, we might just rest in our system as we know it. If we did not have the thorn in the flesh, we may not pray. We may not seek a better society and a better world. We thank you, oh God, that something is happening throughout the world, that there is so much diversity and so many stories are being told that we're going untold. And we just thank you, oh God. We sense that something is changing. And we pray that we live long enough to see it all happen. But if we don't, oh God, give us the strength, the fortitude, the spirit, the willingness, and the pride to make an effort to push this world forward morally and spiritually. And when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing it will be. But until then, let us be found working, sacrificing, and serving for a better day. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. In the name of love, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. And just a reminder to the panelists that we have a post meeting afterwards. Thank you all for being here. God bless you all. And see you at our next webinar, which will be next week on Wednesday. We'll talk about arts and arts organizations.